My guests today are Dan Rumney, JC Dwyer, and Lewis Weil, the nerd bosses of Nerd Nite Austin. The first Thursday of every month, nerds gather together and hear their fellow nerds speak on subjects of deep and personal interest to them. I attended the most recent Nerd Night and learned that Smirnoff popularized the vodka martini through the James Bond movies. I also learned how you can play Mario on Nintendo with your eyes. The next Nerd Night is Thursday, November 4th. That's next Thursday, not tomorrow night, at the U.S. Art Authority. You can learn more at austin.nerdnite.com. Dan, JC, Lewis, welcome to Interviews.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why don't you each tell us what you do for a living and what type of nerd you are, and give us your name as you speak.
Sure. My name is JC Dwyer, and by day I'm a policy wonk, which is a particular flavor of nerd that basically I work for a statewide organization that advocates on behalf of low-income and hungry families, and I'm sort of their research and policy guy.
Okay, so research policy. Okay, nerdy.
I'm Dan Rumney. I work for IBM as a software engineer, so I guess that makes me a computer geek, although I do have a degree in physics, so I'm bridging the science-computer divide.
Okay, pure nerd.
You could say that.
Okay.
I think JC's a compassion nerd. I always tell him that. This is Lewis, and I am a biologist and seaweed farmer, and I am a life science nerd.
So a seaweed farmer. Tell us more about that.
I grow seaweed and sell it at the Sunset Valley Farmers Market.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
For food. It's delicious.
Very interesting. I've never seen seaweed for sale at the farmers market. I'll have to check that out. Dan, tell us how Nerd Night came about.
Sure. So Nerd Nite was originally founded in Boston by a fellow by the name of Chris Balakrishnan. He's a PhD biologist, and every year he would disappear off to Cameroon to investigate parasitic birds like cuckoos and things like that. And he would return, and people would ask him where he'd been, and he would regale them with his stories of research. And the barman one day said, "Well, why don't you just do a presentation to everybody?" So he stood up there, and people gathered around with their beer in hand and listened to him talk about parasitic birds. And from there, Nerd Nite was born, and it then moved to New York, where that's where it really grew. And then while I lived in New York, my now wife met a guy who talked about Chinese curse words there, and she came home and said, "I've just come across something that is right down your alley." I didn't get around to going, and then we moved to Austin, and I emailed Matt Wazowski, who runs Nerd Nite and is pretty much the Nerd Nite
Uber boss?
Uber boss, thank you. The Nerd Nite Uber boss, and said, "Hey, I'd like to set this up." And he's like, "Great, my friend JC Dwyer's just moved down. You guys should meet up." And we did. And then last year in March, we did the first one, and it's kind of snowballed since then.
It does seem like it's actually quite a big thing, and it's growing. Tell us about that. How come?
I think it's just a great idea. I mean, everywhere it goes, people seem to instantly get it and want to reproduce it wherever they live. So a lot of the Nerd Nights across this country have been started by people who attended a Nerd Night and thought, these guys are amateurs. I can do the same thing at home. So
does this mean that nerds have been crying out for their own forum and it finally exists?
I think that's exactly what it means. I think one of the nicest things I've heard someone say when they come up to me is, this is exactly what Austin needs. I think Austin has an abundance of technological and entrepreneurial get-togethers and things like that, and that's great, but they don't serve the purpose that Nerd Nite does, which is an opportunity for someone to talk about what they're really excited about without that having to then have some kind of commercial success. They can just talk about Victorian literature, and people will sit and applaud.
I want to delve more into topics later, but talk about sort of the basic idea, how it works. In other words, people can't just talk about any topic whatsoever. They can. Yeah?
Yeah.
We've had some very out there topics, and we curate the event, so it's not like someone can just run up on stage and start talking. But
no, I mean though that it's got to be a nerdy topic. Yeah,
but you can be nerdy about anything.
Yeah, we broadly define nerdiness. I mean, anything that you're monomaniacal about, whether because you're paid to do it or because it's just something that you love or something that you studied, it's all fair game.
Okay. Where else are there Nerd Nights?
I could reel them all off. I've kind of got them. So there's Boston, New York, Austin, LA, New Orleans, Chicago, Duluth. If we go out of the US, we've got Munich and Berlin. We have Toronto.
Dublin.
We have Dublin. We have Wellington in New Zealand. We have Philadelphia has just this week joined. Erlangen, which I believe is also in Germany, is joining, and they I think Leipzig as well is looking at. I don't know what it is about Germany, but they seem to be. They're the second largest Nerd Nite country in our Nerd Nite rainbow. So.
And DC also.
Oh, DC, of course, yeah.
Is nerd a universal word, or are there different words in different languages for it?
It appears to translate very well. I don't know. And the original catchphrase of Nerd Nite.
It kind of sounds German. No.
It does.
The catchphrase that we used originally, and it's been supplanted by other catchphrases in the meantime, was "It's like the Discovery Channel with beer." And for some reason, that seems to appear on all the international, no matter what language the announcement is being made in, that slogan appears to translate very well.
Do they have Discovery Channel everywhere?
I guess so.
They must know.
How many people attend Nerd Nite in Austin?
We're averaging around 130 now, right?
Yeah. Probably 130, 150, somewhere in there. Lately.
So this is a once-a-month event. That's impressive. I wonder what the general nerd population of Austin is.
You know, we sent out a survey a while back to get an idea of. So you may have been asking about the figures, but what the demographics of the nerd population, and we found that we got a lot of responses, a much better response rate than one would normally expect. We found that it's 50-50 men and women. You know, pretty much, I think it was plus or minus one because we had an odd number of people, and about a third of the attendees are between 20 and 30, about a third are between 30 and 40, and the rest are over 40. So I think there's a pretty diverse group of people who fall within the nerd category. Although interestingly, only 80% of people who come to Nerd Nite identify as a nerd. So 1 in 5 people are either lost or delusional or supporting a friend.
Or don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
But, you know.
All right, let's talk about the word or the people themselves. I want to know how each of you define what a nerd is.
I think it's just someone who loves something that they don't have to love, that they know more than the average person about it, and that they will talk your ear off about it if given the opportunity. I don't think you have to. You could be professional, but you could also just be amateur. It could just be something you are really, really into, and you just know way more than you probably should.
All right, that's Lewis. Dan, what would you say?
I'd love to disagree, but I think there also is an element of you could probably get 100 people who feel that way about the Longhorns, and that's great. But I don't think being a passionate fan of that, or of, I don't know, I can't think of an example, but being a passionate fan of something that a large people are into necessarily makes you a nerd. You need to take it to at least 1 or 2 degrees further than other people to really be
so
a
it's
nerd.
more on the, like, your passion is something that's more on the fringe that not that many people are interested in.
Yeah, so you could be a fan of the Yankees and all you'll ever be is a fan of the Yankees, but if you're into sabermetrics, which is advanced baseball statistics, then you're a nerd, absolutely.
Okay.
What if you were a fan of the Yankees and you knew all their stats going back to 1950 and loved to talk about them? At what point do you become a nerd?
The 10-year mark.
Okay.
All right, I actually looked up the definition of nerd in a couple dictionaries. One is Merriam-Webster, and this is what it says. It's like just totally, totally different. An unstylish, unattractive, or socially inept person, especially one slavishly devoted to intellectual or academic pursuits. And they give computer nerd as an example. And then the other one is dictionary.com, and they say, they have 2 definitions. One, a stupid, irritating, ineffectual, or unattractive person. And the other one is an intelligent but single-minded person obsessed with a non-social hobby or pursuit. And they also give the example of a computer nerd. So what do you guys think of these definitions?
Yeah, see, this is the prejudice that we're trying to dispel with Nerd Nite. There's
Anti-Defamation League.
There's 2 assumptions built into there. One, that nerdiness is a lifestyle, which it doesn't necessarily, you can have a normal everyday life. You can have a clean house and a wife or kids and whatever, but you can be nerdy about a topic and be very excited about it and be a nerd. I think there's also sort of obviously a negative connotation, sort of a pejorative associated with the word. And obviously that doesn't really hold as much anymore now that some of the most successful people in the world, some of the people who make the most money and are the guiding lights for a lot of other folks are nerds. You could argue our president is a nerd.
So do you feel then that the definition of nerd has actually morphed over time and these definitions are not in step with that?
I think that whoever wrote those is probably a nerd and just doesn't want to admit it.
Well, I think back to my childhood, and these are the definitions that I would have given. Like if I thought about, okay, so a lot of my friends, my husband as well, they say that I'm a nerd. But when I was growing up, I never thought that I was one because I didn't fit this definition of socially inept, unattractive, unstylish, irritating. I don't know, maybe I was. But it does seem like nowadays, especially because people say it's hip to be a nerd, which I don't know. I kind of dispute that. But what do you think?
So I think Merriam-Webster are way off base with that definition. I think that's
Merriam.
Well, whatever.
I think it was Webster, actually.
If you looked at the Oxford Dictionary, so no. So I think there's a massive conflation of ideas in that definition there. It's entirely unnecessary to suggest that a nerd has to be antisocial and unclean. Bill Gates is a classic nerd and comes from probably the time when nerd really was in common use. And he was building computers in his garage, and he was building computers, which is pretty much a definition for being a nerd. But now whether you like him or not, he ran a massive company, and he is now fighting malaria. And those are not the actions of someone who is socially inept, nor are they the actions of someone who can't organize themselves enough to be clean. It's just ridiculous to suggest that. Now, as to whether or not being a nerd is hip, I have a personal dislike for the word hip. I think that's about as bad as the old definition of nerd. But I think really it's more a realization that the people that were characterized as nerds have a hell of a lot more to offer the world than just an object of ridicule. So,
JC Lewis, do you have anything to add as far as this it's hip to be a nerd idea?
Just that the times have changed. I think, generally we're a much better educated populace now than we were. There's a lot more people running around with college degrees these days than 30, 40 years ago when when the term first started to become common. And we went through this whole period, particularly in the 90s, where it was those computer nerds specifically who were making the most money and doing the most amazing things and changing the world in the most obvious ways. And that sort of, built the foundation for what we're doing now.
I think that the thing that changes now, the nerds are in charge, and maybe they'll be writing the definitions the next time the dictionary is written.
All right. Well, there are certainly different kinds of nerds. There are, book nerds, gaming nerds, tech nerds. What other nerds am I missing?
Well, I think the topics that we have speak to that. We've had people who are food nerds. We've had people who are policy nerds. We've had people who are medical nerds. I'm just looking at the list here.
Can you be a jock and a nerd?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we've had people give, like Dan said, we've had a presentation on sabermetrics, which is statistics in baseball. We had one guy talk about the history of the World Cup, and he did so without any presentation, just standing on stage yelling about the World Cup for about 20 minutes, and it was awesome.
If you can do that, you can come talk at Nerd Nite.